Before I started making this video, I was thinking of calling Defense Shred the most expensive stat in Honkai Star Rail. After all, Defense Shred gets more powerful the more of it you stack, so naturally it leads to the perfect way to encourage vertical investment, by spreading it out across multiple dupes and light cones across different characters, right? And what's more, Defense Shred hard caps at 100%, so if you really want to encourage a synergy, just tweak the best in slot team's numbers so that they perfectly hit 100 Defense Shred with each other, but either over or under cap with any substitutions. But while the math does line up sometimes, I don't think it's quite true in practice, at least not anymore. Not every best in slot team lines up their Defense Shred perfectly, and it's not uncommon that the quest for perfectly maxing out Defense Shred leads you to forsaking many other equally valuable, if not straight up more important multipliers in the process. And oh boy, ever since the start of the game have we gotten a lot of new ones. First, let's establish some context as to how exactly Defense Shred works though, so that we have a bit of a better context when comparing it to other multipliers. Don't worry if this formula looks pretty intimidating, I'll break it down so that it's a bit easier to understand. The defense multiplier, which represents how much damage is reduced by enemy defenses, is affected both by your attacking character's level as well as the enemy's own level. This is also another reason why you should max your character's levels, as the bigger the difference between the enemy's levels and yours, the less damage you deal. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to assume that everyone has their characters maxed at level 80. Enemy levels, on the other hand, aren't actually quite as fixed, with Pure Fiction 4 having a much lower standard of level 85 enemies, and King and Check boasting level 100 enemies, or even level 120 if playing versus Plight. That being said, enemy defense stops increasing at level 100, so your damage dealt versus Checkmate should be the same as against Plight, if for some reason you're thinking about challenging that game mode. For the vast majority of us non-Leviathans though, the takeaway should be that Defense Shred scales with enemy level, making it better in a vacuum versus game modes with higher enemy levels, like MOC and Anomaly Arbitration Night stages, compared to game modes like Pure Fiction and Apocalyptic Shadow. However, Star Rail's combat is not actually as vacuous as our main character's average headspace, so we must instead consider what is actually being thrown at us in endgame scenarios. And well, both of these supposedly weaker endgames for Defense Shred happen to have another built-in stat, vulnerability. Pure Fiction gives 50% vulnerability whenever you enter Surging Grit, and considering how a team's success in that game mode depends on how often they can repeatedly enter and maintain Surging Grit, I'd say that amount matters a lot. An Apocalyptic Shadow situation is even more drastic, not only giving you 100% vulnerability when the enemy's weakness broken, but also cutting your damage in half when not, meaning that the vast majority of your damage is going to be inflicted on a massively vulnerable enemy. For some perspective, assuming you have the same amount of Death Shred and Res Pen, adding 1% more Defense Shred would start outweighing the benefits of adding 1% more Vuln at around 43% of each, or about a Pella ult's worth and a Cypher talent's worth respectively. Anything past that point is in Death Shred's favor, up to 100%, since Death Shred is the only stat in the game with increasing marginal returns on your final damage. In other words, adding Defense Shred becomes more powerful than Vulnerability in a vacuum at roughly 43% of both. You can also replace Vuln with Res Pen or True Damage here, since the formulas for calculating all three are identical. Though of course Res Pen can start at negative values, which skews the value in Res Pen's favor versus resistant enemies. In Pure Fiction's 50% vulnerability during Surging Grit though, even without adding any more sources of vulnerability, Defense Shred starts becoming more powerful once it hits 45%. And with Apoc Shadow's 100% vulnerability, well, let's just say that Defense Shred is always more powerful in that game mode. The vulnerability dilution is also present on lots of enemies with self-breaking mechanics, who often take 50% more damage to really encourage breaking them, as well as in smaller amounts for miscellaneous other enemies. While 100% Vuln is much rarer without the help of endgame buffs, it is possible versus certain fights, like with Lygus and with Sparksicon. Do note that adding vulnerability still isn't bad versus these enemies, it just becomes less efficient versus other semi-equivalent multipliers like True Damage, Res Pen, and of course Defense Shred. A 1% increase in vulnerability always results in adding the same amount of final damage, no matter if it's your first percent or your 299th percent. The same is not true of Defense Shred, which directly becomes stronger the more you stack it. Looking at the rightmost section of this table, we can see that adding the first 10% Defense Shred ends up increasing your final damage by less than 6%, but the last 10% defense shred is an over 11% increase. Naturally, this means that defense shred is a very self-serving stat. Even compared to speccing into a new multiplier, stacking more death shred is just more efficient until you hit the 100% cap. Of course, changing around supports usually affects several different multipliers at once, so this shouldn't be taken as a conclusion that death shred focused supports are inherently the strongest without considering more details. Interestingly, if we revisit the formula, the way it's set up is such that ignoring all of an enemy's defense causes the final damage multiplier to always be set to 100%. This means that your characters are effectively able to ignore enemy levels when dealing damage, hence the improvement from 100% defense down being stronger versus higher level enemies with higher defenses. With that in mind, the question naturally begs itself: where can I get defense shred from? Well, let's get the easier situation out of the way and start with endgame content. Because, yeah, they're not exactly what I would call commonplace in endgame yet. As far as enemies go, only 4 in the entire game have some way to lower their or their allies' defenses. That's 1 per version. Compared to the 21 enemies that can self-apply vulnerability to themselves, that's kind of a huge difference. If I had to guess the reason for this amount of defense shred scarcity, it's probably because they want to prevent overcapping defense from happening. After all, what's the point of designing an enemy to favorably interact versus a certain mechanic if the favorite archetype in question doesn't benefit nearly as much compared to the others? Yeah, the Overcooked Elite truly lives up to its name in this regard. And despite what recency bias might suggest, defense down has been surprisingly sparse from endgame as a whole. And as far as I can recall, it's only appeared once in MOC to help Dr. Ratio fulfill his debuff requirement. While the defense down debuffs were arguably wasted with enough vertical investment, you weren't always guaranteed to roll defense down debuffs, given the existence of 4 others to choose from as well. Side note though, the extra turn per cycle attached to it is kind of insane. Version 1 MOC buffs truly were something else, huh? Defense shred is also available as a selectable buff versus a grand total of 1 Apocalyptic Shadow boss via Pollux, though it is consistent across both of its appearances. Not that Memo Sprites needed the help, but the fact that a full E6S5 Mono Rem team can't use this buff due to perfectly capping out on defense shred is pretty funny. Perhaps then, the idea that defense shred appears pretty often in endgame, if there ever was such a sentiment to begin with, came from Anomaly Arbitration's track record. While it still is only present in 2 of the bosses via Lygus on release and Illwish right now, that's still a third of all King stages so far. Illwish's defense shred buff shielding Elation, with the second line providing extra help to Silverwolf level 999, is no surprise, but the defense shred buff for Lygus being specifically geared towards the Herta definitely breaks the trend of defense shred buffs, helping the rich archetypes getting even richer. Both Phainon and Mono Remembrance, who can circumvent the damage and energy drain per target hit debuffs, and as such had a generally easier time versus Lygus, had a different boost tailored to them. All I can say is that overall, defense shred from external endgame sources is about as rare as DDD reruns, with 4 different enemies and 4 patches worth of mechanics to speak of. And because of this lacking sample size, it's really hard to say whether or not we'll continue to have defense shred mechanics tailored towards us in the future. Honestly, it's just in a really awkward place at the moment as far as endgame design goes, seeing as how it only really hits its peak by stacking more of it, but it also falls off just as fast due to defense shred's 100% hard cap. If you want something more consistent though, let's look at something that's a bit more involved on our end, namely our teammates and how we can build them. Let's start by looking at Relics, shall we? It all started in version 1.0 with the 4-piece Quantum set. Obviously, this set was tailored towards Quantum characters, but with the 20% defense shred only requiring a Quantum weak enemy made it surprisingly versatile, especially considering that this was the competition. And since Silverwolf could both force Quantum weak on any enemy, as well as stack the defense shred needed herself to make the 20% defense shred a near 20% damage increase, this relic set ended up being more versatile than its other elemental brethren. Heck, the set was even being actively recommended on Jing Liu over the Ice set, and she only had 12% defense to stack on her Light Cone. It definitely helped that the True Sting wouldn't stop appearing in every single game mode, providing a consistent Quantum weak boss to punch, Like, seriously, I know we meme about Choir and Hule being everywhere nowadays, but this bug was truly the very first to do it. Fitting as a spawn of propagation, I suppose. It wouldn't be until version 2 that a new competing DPS relic would finally arise in the form of 4-piece Diver, providing a strong balance of 12% damage, 8% crit rate, and 24% crit damage to every single one of your attacks, so long as you had 3+ debuffs up. And for meta DPS like Dr. Ratio and Acheron, that so-called requirement was their baseline. But taking a step back for a moment, it's crazy that Hoyo took a full version to finally power creep the Quantum set for non-Quantum DPSs. It was still by far the go-to for Quantum characters old and new, even beating out the follow-up set for Jade, the follow-up queen at the time, versus Quantum weak enemies, especially if you stacked her Lycone on top, which was just another Quantum set's worth of defense shred. And with how defense shred works, remember, twice the amount is more than twice the benefit. Even when a quote-unquote better Quantum set via Poet came out with a whopping 32 crit rate to finally rival 4-piece Quantum's 20 defense shred, Quantum still found uses when Poet's speed lowering and 95 speed maximum were too strict, making the two sets side grades to each other. In fact, I am of the personal belief that Hoyo specifically coded Memo Sprites to not work with 4-piece Quantum's defense shred, partially so that players wouldn't be stuck farming the same 1.0 set again. Because if 20% defense shred was enough to dissuade Jade, a follow-up character, from using the follow-up attack set, imagine Casterus' S1 signatures not pairing with Quantum with its staggering 30% defense shred. Because as well as Poet paired with Tribi, both looks-wise and effects-wise, with the lower speed being an advantage for her thanks to her limited 2-turn ult uptime and plenty of off-turn actions, she could still opt into 4-piece Quantum if she wanted to go faster for some reason, mainly to enable Von Whack builds at 120 speed. And for a more traditional Quantum DPS like Archer, who couldn't use Poet's full effect anyways, with the high base speed as a hunt, well, Quantum was, you guessed it, his best in slot. In fact, Quantum was best in slot for Anaxa too, who mind you was not actually a Quantum DPS, losing on the 2 pieces 10% damage, but had so much defense shred built in, along with the ability to consistently apply Quantum weakness, that the set was a no-brainer at his best, even with over half of his personal defense shred gone at E0S0. The fact that both of these characters just got new best in slot DPS sets recently really speaks to the absolute strength of 4-piece Quantum, and just how timeless 20% defense shred as a free stat really is. Of course, Hoyo was aware of this well beforehand, as evidenced by the release of the Prisoner set for DOT in 1.5, and Black Swan's accompaniment 2 short patches later. With DOT not having access to crit's usual multipliers, the ability to gain any amount of defense shred from a relic set, let alone up to 18%, made this the most obvious must-farm set for DOT mains, even if your Kafka didn't have her S1 to make proccing the full effect with 3 DOTs easier, and even before Black Swan's release. With her release though, the very thought of running any other set was not even in the same stratosphere, since at just E0S1, Swan herself was capable of reaching nearly 90% defense shred, and capable of hitting the perfect 100% cap at maximum vertical investment, and as early as E3S5. This set was made for her. Funny enough, just like 4-piece Quantum, if you could somehow inflict 3 DOTs without suffering a huge enough damage loss, there was absolutely nothing stopping you from slapping the set onto a crit DPS. In fact, with the 12% attack and 18% defense shred, this set was actually slightly stronger than 4-piece Quantum for non-Quantum carries, leading to it being a tech option for 2.0's MOC, with the DOT trotters who fulfilled this condition for everyone for free. Ever since then, while this set has fallen out of favor for generic DPSs, it has yet to be replaced for DOT itself, with the introduction of Hysolins, her ability to stack 4 DOTs by herself at E0, and the path of 25% defense shred on her ult, only cementing its giga value for the archetype. Sure, there is the aforementioned issue of causing Swan to overcap on defense shred, especially with their Nova Flare making the full defense shred effect always active, but you can always just swap SIGs if you're that worried. All in all, this relic set remains in both DOT's past and present, and will likely persist in the future as well, seeing as how our 2 premium DPSs in the archetype are specifically built to utilize it to its full effect. Next up, breaking the mold of the standard 20% defense shred relics, but still hovering somewhere in that relative range is of course the Cavalry set, with 10% defense shred on break and a staggering 25% on super break. I actually covered the potencies of break's defense shred stacking in my vulnerability deep dive, so feel free to check that out for more details, but for a quick summary, break's vertical investment is perfectly tuned so that Boothill, who has an extra 20% defense shred from his light cone compared to his peers, is able to max out his defense shred perfectly with his S1, E1, and E1s of both Sunday and Ron May, while Firefly and Rappa can perfectly hit 100% defense shred with their full verticals in Linksha, Ron May, and Fugue. With E3 Dahlia also having 20% defense shred, this actually doesn't change break's defense shred potency at all, instead letting you replace any of Linksha, Fugue, Ron May, or Sun God in order to hit the same cap. And since no changes have been made, this makes Cavalry the clear, uncontested best in slot as well. So yeah, that's all the defense shred relics. As you can see, each one of them has stood the test of time relatively unchallenged, with no room for debate. Wait, what do you mean we just got another one? Yeah, similar to Break's verticals, Elation seems to be leading into the 20% defense shred per investment rule, with the funny exception in Evanesia's S1, which not only stands out for being the sole vulnerability applier, but for also being the only DPS stake of the bunch with team-wide benefits. Not that this means she'll be kicked out of the Battleship bundle necessarily, heck, look at both Firefly and Rappa lacking defense shred on their S1s, but rather that no matter how you look at it, Elation is missing an additional source of defense shred from a dedicated support, 24% of it at maximum investment to be precise. In the meantime, it does mean that they pair pretty well with a Nova Flared Sparkle's E2 30% defense shred, as well as both Ashvale and Nova Welt's base 40% for the S1 gamers out there. But given how both Break and Dot have proven that swapping out supports while still maintaining defense shred synergy is more than possible, it's not hard to see why many players, myself included, are just waiting for the next inevitable round of DLC to arrive. If you want to use that pattern to hold on to the idea that Elation is due for its DLC soon, or that it's going to receive constant love and attention as another chosen archetype, or even that it's going to have to wait another year for another wave of broken support, be my guest either way. I honestly couldn't tell you what plans they have for this archetype in the near future, besides almost certainly a premium sustain to keep the squishies of this archetype from falling over and crumbling once the Elation shill ends. Anyways, with the first look at Relic Center Defense Shred archetypes covered, let's move on to something a bit more universal with light cones, with a special focus on nihility. Now, shall we? Let's start in the very beginning, with two supportive 4-star nihility light cones that still see use today. Pearls and Tutorial were Hoyo's first attempts at making energy generating and amp-related light cones for the path respectively, and pretty much set the standard for all supportive light cones in their line going forward. 16% defense shred and 8 energy per hit are both very respectable numbers, especially for 4-star light cones, one of which was actually free. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that they weren't just respectable, they were downright top tier. On Silverwolf's original banner way back in 1.1, her signature light cone was actually straight up outclassed by both options. Compared to Pearl's, the 12% increase from the vulnerability was just plain weaker than the AMP and S4 Pearls would provide when stacked with her 53% defense shred. Add in 4-piece Quantum to the mix, and suddenly that dropped as low as S2. Now of course, this was still relatively new into HSR's lifespan, so getting an S5 copy of a 4-star gacha light cone that hadn't yet received a rate up was pretty unlikely. Not to mention that lower superimpositions also came with lower base chances, which, if you know anything about the effect hit rate formula, makes it an absolute pain to consistently land the Pearl's debuff without an S5 copy. So for its time, Silverwolf's S1 was pretty great value. Is what I would say a Tutorial didn't serve to fix her 3 to 4 turn alt rotation. Yeah, this unit was genuinely so janky pre-Nova Flare. Release units could get away with a lot thanks to the 3-star thresholds being 20 cycles instead of the current 10 or less. Even back then though, the fact that Silverwolf was being used with Sela made it pretty enticing to have her single target ult up more often so that she could keep her debuffs applied to the new enemy the speedy butterfly lady was hunting down. Really, the only reason you consider this light cone is to try and spec into her sub DPS capabilities, since 12 crit rate and 24 effect hit rate is a lot of stats being covered at once, and the bonus 5-star base attack certainly doesn't hurt either. Later on, this light cone could also see some situational value in rare cases, where you were already overcapping on defense shred, or needed the tank stats from this 5-star light cone, but I don't think most of you would ever be concerned with this, speaking as someone who tried both situations, and B, it's still obsolete on both fronts with all the better options today. Speaking of better options, it seems like Hoyo sure changed up their tune quick after seeing how Silverwolf's signature flopped, because the very next Premium Nihility crit DPS, Acheron, cut herself off from both effect hit rate and energy, killing any potential free-to-play ult synergy that Tutorial might have had, and making Pearls even worse of a choice than it already was, compared to damage-oriented light cones like Good Night and Sleep Well, due to the base chance being a straight-up waste. Though in all fairness, this mainly killed Silverwolf's own signature as a cope option, since Pearls and Tutorial were often much better on your Pella and Wolf anyways. Good luck trying to land a 100% base chance debuff consistently when it can't be reapplied on the same enemy like Pearls, and is also on a character with zero reason to build effect hit rate otherwise. Speaking from experience, coping on Acheron with Incessant Rain was excessively awful. But if you want to look at more traditional support DPS hybrids for comparison instead, look no further than the DOT duo just before. It's pretty clear from their design that Hoyo did not want Kafka to become a tutorial bot on release, seeing as how she had a staggering 130% base chance to land her shocks, basically removing the need for effect hit rate altogether, and gain passive energy upon killing an enemy, making her less attack dependent for consistent ult rotations. Heck, the introduction of the Prisoner set in 1.5 made her S1 look even better thanks to it having a DOT attached, and thus making it even easier to proc the Relic's full 18% defense shred condition for 3 DOTs, especially if on a team with just her and one other DOT applier. Even with Black Swan and her ult, making your DOTs count as 4 different types at once, that ult wasn't exactly consistently available all the time, and plus, boosting both Kafka's damage and speed was significant at this time, so you really were encouraged to just put the SIG in the bag. Funny how that script is completely flipped nowadays, since with more frequent attacks post Nova Flare, Kafka went from a tutorial hater to a character who is defined by it. Low-key though, I think Hoyo is still in denial that it is her true best in slot, with how it's still absent from any of her trial kits. Going back to that whole Black Swan ult isn't consistently up issue, yeah, this is where tutorial sins truly come into the light. Getting rid of Pearls was easy enough since Black Swan wanted a damage boosting cone that also boosted her effect hit rate due to her high stat requirements in that field. As for Tutorial, well, it seems that the solution was to just make her so dog water at regenning her ult that Tutorial basically makes no difference in her ult rotations anyways. You hate to see it. This same problem plagued both Fugue and Cypher, with the former having a lower than 1 attack per turn rate as a Nihility, due to her skill being the only non-attack move in the entire path. For similar reasons, she also did not play well with Pearls, both for its awkward 1-turn only debuffs, and the fact that she couldn't always save her slow as Molasses 130 energy ult to apply it before a speedier Firefly, Rappa, or Boot Hill attacked first, when bosses switched phases, or whenever new enemies spawned. I seriously underestimated how strong the Bluetooth vulnerability application was on her S1 before using it, especially when taken alongside the fact that the debuffs last for 2 turns, not 1 like Pearls. Though, honestly, the latter is even more egregious in terms of tutorial anti-synergies, due to being the only character in the game that is usually rewarded for holding her ult as long as possible. As for how to get her off Pearls, well, copy the higher than normal base chances of Kafka, then make a signature that gives her much needed speed to max her true damage calculation, matches with their higher base chances, applies AoE refreshable debuffs even on single target attacks for Acheron and other AoE DPS, and even does it 2 at a time for better doctor ratio synergy. Seriously though, that Lycone is insanely loaded. Pearls Pro Max certainly does not disappoint. And as for Hysolence and Dahlia, well, they do work pretty well with Tutorial, but honestly, their signature Lycones are so loaded, and in Hysolence's case, her driver has already stolen Tutorial anyway, so no need to worry about their signatures being weak options at all. Perhaps the most annoying case regarding Hoyo's balancing around Tutorial though, is the changes to Welt's Nova Flare. Wanna know why they lowered his ult's bonus refund energy by 5? That's right, it's so that you're still forced to run as E2 in order to get 2-turn ults with tutorial. You're still just short of a skill alt rotation without Eidolons. Look, I can't complain about his Nova Flare on the whole when it brought him straight out of the depths of tier 5 into a viable cost chesting unit for 0 cycles, but between this stun and his E6 only boosting the crit rate of his skill and ult and not his talent, someone needs to be fired at Hoyo for making his Eidolons both baseline and awkward to fully have at the same time. Looking at the other defense-reducing light cones though, mainly as far as DPS are concerned, we see a much more evolving story though. In versions 1 and 2, these light cones, all of which were 5-star limited DPS light cones after Pearl's release, were primarily focused on Defense Shred as a way to stand out damage-wise, compared to the other options. Starting from humble origins, we have Jingliu's signature, the very first Defense Shred light cone. It was definitely her best in slot, but more so because of her attack saturation, making Aeon, the generic destruction light cone option at the time, less beneficial for her, in comparison to the 20% crit damage and exclusive 42% damage buffs this light cone also provided to her. The 12% defense shred she could only access as well was just a cherry on top if anything. Dr. Ratio's light cone on the other hand had a much more significant portion of its power budget allotted to defense down. Not only is 24% a significantly larger number than 12, but with a more direct reliance on stacking debuffs built in, and defense shred supports like Silverwolf and Pella being chock full of them, he's more likely to use that stat to its full advantage. A 100% foolproof synergy if you ask me. We've already gone over how well Black Swan Sig having defense shred self-synergizes with the rest of her kit and relics, so I'll just mention that just like Jingliu and Ratio, the defense shred effect was pretty much exclusively good for her, and her alone. Well, until Hyslun's at least. This philosophy with these types of light cones being a good personal increase exclusively for their limited DPS continued with Jade, since, well, incorporating basics into your rotation is awkward for basically every other erudition, including Xingyuan. And the fact that it only benefited ults and follow-ups meant that Xingque, while easily able to proc its effect as well as stack 4-piece Quantum on top, only received the boost for about half of her actual damage, since Jade's Sig only boosted the weaker part of her enhanced basic at E4, which isn't even guaranteed, as well as her very infrequent and relatively low damage ultimate. And for our final entry in this early era of Star Rail, we have none other than Fei Xiao's S1. 54% defense shred looks like a lot, and it is a lot, but when you consider that besides the crit rate, it's the only boost on her light cone, it starts to look a bit more balanced, especially when you consider that even the slowest attacking follow-up unit far outpaces the top attack speed frequency of the fastest Nihility. And since the benefit of that signature is basically entirely concentrated on her ult, that difference in attack frequency matters a lot. In other words, Fei's signature is able to have such high defense shred because none of her best teammates are actually able to stack defense shred as well. She's a one-woman army in this regard. From version 3 and onwards, Hoyo would never allow for such an absurd amount of defense shred on a single source again, potentially because they realized that stacking so much of it and nothing else on a character would make it harder to sell their DLC, or maybe even because raw stat boosts can eventually be overcome with enough smart play and farming. Instead, it seems like their design philosophy when it comes to signatures shifted from pure damage power creep to also including utility power creep as well. Every single one of the following light codes we're going to be discussing has a unique benefit that no amount of relic farming or godlike substats can hope to replicate. So even with the newly implemented dice and increase in self-modeling resonance received, you still have a reason to pull for these new S1s. First off, we have Castoris, who, well, you really have to admire how badly they wanted to push her vertical investment. For starters, she was basically locked to Poet due to Membo Sprites receiving 0 benefits from 4-piece Quantum, which, when you think about the fact that they purposely locked a Quantum character with a high defense ignore S1 out of the Quantum set, yeah, it's quite a situation, alright. And then, thanks to Poet setting your stat screen speed to 95 at most, and E0 S0 Castoris, with their best in slot relic set, couldn't naturally hit 134 speed for that 2 actions per 0 cycle breakpoint, hence the advanced ties her signature, which then became useless if you had her E2. Look, I can kind of see the logic behind this, being that if you chose casters as E2, you could forego her S1, framing her vertical as a quote-unquote better deal, but A, devaluing an S1 because of an E2 is genuinely baffling game design, and B, that didn't stop her sake from being basically mandatory anyways just because of how much of a stat stick it was. Which, who knows, maybe that was their intention the whole time. Luckily, future attempts to make defense shred signatures relevant were much more elegant in nature, with Anaxa's S1 offering a generous amount of benefits, not conflicting with his vertical this time by guaranteeing his 2-turn ultimates, as well as being the first defense shred DPS cone whose debuff was usable for all allies. It seems like they really did design his light cone for his hyper carry potential though, since on the Herta teams, 12% defense shred was really not all that much amp. The Herta got more damage out of Scholar set until you E1 S1 your Anaxa, and even then the Quantum set was still only a marginal upgrade at best. Who would you even stack defense shred with otherwise in the Herta team? E4 Tribi? E6 Danhung PT later down the line? Please. Also, as a supportive light cone, the energy per turn was genuinely irrelevant since it didn't get you your turn 1 ult any faster, and 2 double skills with an ERR rope was guaranteed as ult anyways. It's not like missing out on an attack rope was bad either, since he was barely contributing to damage on a third team anyways, due to high speed eagle being the optimal way to run him. And on other supportive air additions like Mini Herta, the loss of the 60% damage effect made this light cone also lose out to other 5-star air addition light cones like Jin Yuan's. Heck, even Himiko's standard 5-star light cone outdamages it in pure fiction scenarios. I think it really just goes to show how scared Hoyo was when making weakless implant kits. First Silverwolf with her worse than Pella ult uptime, then Boothill and Firefly with only single target weakness implants to start, and then a support who only offers 50% damage and 12% defense shred at E0S1 to his main DPS exclusively in Anaxa, while also nerfing his own crit damage by 140% should he choose this support role. Even 2 patches later, Archer has his E2 implant tied to a low uptime single target ult, and Phainon with perma-physical weak has so much bounce in his kit that any fodder mobs hard counter his ability to break. Dahlia has her permanent weakness implant locked off until E2, and in the current day, Silverwolf 999, who is by far the strongest form of weakness implant in the game as of now, doesn't get it until, you guessed it, her E6. Sure, Firefly is definitely a great breaker in today's day and age thanks to her Nova Flare finally giving her side weakness implants, but consider the fact that it took 2 years and a whole lot of favoritism for her to get to that point, and also that she's probably the only good breaker at E0 who doesn't have to sacrifice much in order to break efficiently versus all weakness types nowadays. Anyways, let's break from talking about toned down kits and return to our regularly scheduled programming. Okay, what the heck is Phainon's light cone, man? Even if we ignore the 60% damage buff, this light cone has so much raw stats that the first 2 effects alone make it an instant pickup for every non-HP scaling destruction besides Saber. And with it, the damage so heavily outranks light cones like Yunli's signature, especially with any additional sources of defense down, that it sometimes becomes worth considering on the counter units as well. Of course, Firefly Post Nova doesn't really need Phainon's light cone as much due to lower speed requirements most of the time, as well as potential defense shred overcap issues, but man, that base attack really helps getting closer to breaking even with her attack to break effect conversion trace. Well, it seems like they learned from Anaxa and casters both and made an actually good Memo Sprite and support light cone later on too, that doesn't need a set shackling it down to function as intended. Sure, the price to pay is to lock the support behind Memo Sprites, but considering how Remembrance geared Evernight is already, that's a very small fee if any at all. And finally, let's take a look at both Sparksy's and Silverwolf 999's light cones at the same time here since, well, they're pretty much the same signature, just in different flavors. Both of them are good stat 6 to help them increase their elation, Sparksy via the extra base attack and Superwolf via the extra speed. They both help also these characters generate punchline, Sparksy indirectly by raising the skill point cap and letting her consume more skill points for punchline generation without overflowing, and Silverwolf 999 directly by giving her 20 every ult straight up. And of course, both offer defense shred. Sure, Sparxy's also comes with a team-wide 20% Elation amp, but an Elation MC technique low rolls worth isn't anything mind-blowing, to be honest. With the lack of alternative options for both, and how uniquely each Lycone caters to each of their kits, I think it's fair to say that, although their E2s are arguably much stronger, they cap off the trend of defense shred DPS Lycones becoming more and more specialized and utility-oriented over time. Gone are the days of E0 S0 DPS with their signatures only serving as damage boosts. They really are just putting portions of kits into character Lycones now. With both Relics and Lycones out of the way though, that leaves only one area left to explore: characters and their vertical investments. But rather than focus only on what they do, let's instead talk about why you honestly shouldn't make defense shred your primary focus all the time, and instead look at the bigger picture. Starting with our first case study, we have good old Mono Quantum. Way back before Nova Flares were even a thing, at its maximum vertical investment, the very first true Mono Quantum core of Silverwolf, Sparkle, as well as any Quantum DPS and Sustain were capable of dishing out almost 100% defense shred, and quite consistently at that, since 4-piece Genius's full defense shred would almost always be active thanks to Silverwolf's guaranteed Quantum implant. Even if you didn't have the Silverwolf Eidolons, to approach the 100% defense shred limit this closely, you could still get pretty much the whole way there with just her base kit, since she only gained 2.6 defense shred from her E3 and E5. However, as a single target debuffer with an extremely long cooldown ult as mentioned before, both of the Quantum DPS at the time in Seela and Ching Shui didn't exactly pair well with her. Seela had her resurgence mechanic, encouraging her to quickly rack up kills versus multiple enemies, meaning she far outran Silverwolf's bugs, and Ching Shui was a blast DPS, meaning that this combo would only further neglect her already weaker side profile damage. In fact, without Silverwolf's debuffs, you'd have your defense shred cut down by almost half, translating to an almost 40% DPS loss, or potentially even more if losing out on Genius's 10% extra defense shred by fighting quantum weak enemies. As such, it was much better to rely on a more rapid fire and most importantly, AoE debuffer in Pella, who lacked the quantum implant to always bring out 4-piece Genius's full value, but had much more consistent uptime on her debuffs, preventing any some sort of damage drop off from our quantum carries. Or you could just run Ting Yun or Ron Mei instead if you were that worried about your debuffs falling off. Harmony supports, ladies and gentlemen. The core reason that Mono Quantum failed as an archetype is because its foundation was centered around a support, without taking the DPS's own needs into mind. Now, in a post-Nova Flare world where the entire cast is buffed, and most importantly, Silverwolf finally has AoE debuffs, it is still very much possible for the idea of Mono Quantum to still thrive, with the above team being Seela's lowest cost 0 cycle versus current Endless Siege Dark Sam as of making this video. However, versus game modes like Pure Fiction for example, where debuffs are simply way too slow for the high attack frequency the constant wave of enemies demands, characters like Ceridra skyrocket in value, despite the fact that teams using her often don't even come close to hitting the 100% defense shred cap. It all comes down to the environment at the end of the day. Going quickly over our next examples, which serve more as reminders at this point given how we've already covered them extensively, both DOT and Break prove that hitting 100% defense shred doesn't lock a team in place either. In DOT's case, Black Swan hitting a perfect 100% defense shred at maximum vertical didn't change the fact that Hyslin still added a significant amount of defense shred to the team, nor did they perfectly plan around the idea of capping defense shred with her, assuming you just slap Swan's cone onto her. But even with these mismatched numbers, I don't think anyone is going to argue that the two are not best in slot together, especially since they also support each other in several other aspects. And in Break's case, the Dahlia is proof that if the numbers fit well enough on the old archetype but Hoya wants to bring it back, they can't just put in DLC to outright replace one of the existing defense shred slots. After all, support Eidolons don't always guarantee that a character is going to be forever bound to the team. All it takes is for one key support to fundamentally change how the archetype gets to function, and all of a sudden, what used to be quite necessary isn't nearly as needed anymore. And well, that's exactly what happened with Phainon. After all, looking at the Chrysos errors, only a select few are truly locked to single target buffs, much like Sunday just before Amphorius. Heck, even RMC has some AoE crit damage in their base kit, making them not quite a true hypercarry support. Putting the hypercarry supports of Amphorius all together with the ultimate hypercarry candidate reveals a pretty deliberate design, with everyone's maximum investments perfectly adding up to 80 defense shred on Phainon's regular attacks, and a clean 100% on Ceredra's Peerage enhanced skills. And thanks to E1 Sundays, 40% defense shred for summons exclusively, Dan's Soul Dragons are always capped on defense shred, despite usually being unable to benefit from Peerage's bonus defense shred. Even if you could argue that a sustain in the team was a damage loss, it's kinda hard to deny that the entire collective had a solid vision with its synergy. Ceredra's 30% speed boost, allowing for an effortless -1 setup with Sunday on attack boots Phainon. Ceredra's copied skills and Dan Hung's Soul Dragons, both working inside Phainon's solo field, and Sunday providing the upfront core flame, skill points, and Soul Dragon frequency buffs needed to make the team feel uber comfortable. That being said, not only is this level of investment completely obscene to hit the 100% cap, especially since it requires a support E6 and an S5 limited light cone to achieve, but it's not even close to Phainon's actual strongest team comp, especially after a certain someone's Nova Flare. To understand why exactly Sparkle post Nova Flare maintains arguably the second most important position in a Phainon team, I think it's important to analyze just how strong her buffs are. See, the typical meta support usually has 2 to 3 different multipliers that they boost at once. Take E1 Trivi for example, with her 24% res pen, 30% vulnerability, and 24% true damage. Nova Flare Sparkle at E0 has 4 different multipliers. Sure, her 10% res pen doesn't sound like much on its own, being only a 1.1 times damage multiplier, but when you stack it with her 30% vulnerability, a 1.3 times damage multiplier, roughly 90% crit damage buffs, which on a 300 crit damage character translates to about yet another 1.23 times damage multiplier, and 40% attack, which on a 4k attack character is yet another modest but not insignificant 1.14 times damage multiplier. And all of a sudden, that 10% multiplier from res pen is actually representing an 18% addition to your final damage, taking Sparkle's overall damage output from about 1.81 times the original value to basically 2 times. In other words, she's getting almost double the mileage out of her res pen because she has so many small yet significant enough multipliers that all compound off of each other. And then you slap on her E1 for an extra 40% attack on top of that broken E2 for a very significant 30 defense shred, introducing yet another multiplier on top of the previous 4. And yeah, now she's multiplying that same Phainon's damage by 2.7 times now. Every improvement counts, not just the big shiny E2. Contrast this to Sunday, who effectively only has 2 multipliers he raises in damage percent and crit damage percent. Technically he does also raise crit rate, but unless your crit ratio is so bad that you're not able to hit 100% crit rate in battle without him, you can essentially think of it as an extra 40 crit damage tackled on. So although his 80% damage contribution, including his technique, and a 130% crit damage buff are much higher singular stat buffs, with the damage percent being about a 40% increase on a 100 damage Phainon, and a 32.5% crit damage increase on a 300 crit damage Phainon respectively, the fact that he only has those 2 multipliers to rely on end up making his amp unable to surpass Sparkle's at a 1.86 times damage increase. And unlike Sparkle's Eidolons, his E1 offers a much lower defense shred contribution to Phainon himself, while his E2 only piles on a stat he already has a lot of, especially if running him with DHPT to try and improve his pyre damage amp to a much more acceptable 130%. In total, this results in only a 2.27 times multiplier at E2, in contrast to Sparkle's 2.7. I guess this is just a really long-winded way of saying that if you give a support who already has so many solid multipliers that work with each other, and then add another very potent multiplier in defense shred, plus the ability to max it out on said team, then yeah, get ready to see some explosive damage. In fact, this damage ends up being so potent that it can be even worth swapping your relic set out for 4-piece Quantum just to best cap defense shred if you have, say, an E0 Sunday or any other non-defense shred related support as your 4th slot instead. While it's generally hard to swap out characters on a team willy-nilly, DPS relics are much more interchangeable depending on your team scenario, and we haven't yet gotten to a point where the 20% defense shred benchmark set by 4-piece Quantum way back in 1.0 is never not going to be consideration. In fact, I'd go as far as to say if you're not sure what to farm, you can never go wrong with collecting one of 3 types of relics. The Eagle Likes, which help lower your speed break points, the Sacerdos Likes, which offer personal amp to your DPS from your supports, and of course, the Quantum Likes, whose defense shred makes them a good old reliable option for anyone that can use them. And as we discussed before in the Relics section, the conditions for use are surprisingly more versatile than you'd think. After all, look at Ruri still using Quantum Set on Acheron over her usual best in slot in Pioneer as recently as last week for the upcoming Flame Reaver MOC showcase, thanks to a Quantum Weak environment as well as insane amounts of defense shred between Mortenax Blade, Pearls, and Cypher's Pearls Pro Max. Speaking of Mortenax Blade, by the way, let's talk about him, because he genuinely changes a lot, but not in ways I've seen others cover, because for the first time in history, we have a truly strong generic supported E0 that offers quite a significant source of defense shred. But let's be real, 99% of us are either main or duo DPSing with Blade or using him to revive our Acheron. So towards that latter point, let's see if we need to make any relic changes to our previously generic best in slot, Pioneer. With Mortenax Blade's release providing Acheron with a staggering 125% damage, almost doubling her damage percent bonus at E0, the 12% damage contribution from Pioneer only translates to about a 3.2% increase, or 3% if you're stuck running a damage percent orb on Acheron. However, Blade doesn't touch your crit damage, meaning that the 8 crit rate and 24 crit damage from Pioneer isn't diluted from Acheron's previous E0 S1 values, allowing the effectively 40 extra crit damage from this set to still act as a 14.3% increase. Note that these damage and crit damage values represent an effective minimum floor, and can go up with better relic substats and investment. And as such, we can assume that Pioneer represents about an 18% baseline improvement compared to no 2 or 4-piece relic bonuses whatsoever, subject to potentially go down with more saturation. Keep this 18% number in mind, as it'll be the benchmark against what 4-piece Quantum has to compete against. Now, obviously, we have to assume that the enemy is Quantum weak for 4-piece Quantum to stand a chance, since the 10% defense shred boost versus non-Quantum weak enemies only ever results in a 12.5% damage increase at most. With that said, here are the list of Nihilities and Nihility Light Cones you might consider running with good old Blaine here, along with Ashvale if you're a Sustainless or E2 Acheron gamer. Kinda funny how he shares the same defense shred as Welt, must be a coincidence I guess. The amount of defense shred you need for 20% of it to beat out Pioneer as a whole actually exists as a threshold, since obviously you don't want too little of it to not benefit from its non-linear scaling, but also because you don't want to overcap the 100% defense shred limit by too much. Defense shred is also more powerful versus higher level endgame enemies as mentioned before, so for King and Check, the threshold for max power Quantum to beat out Pioneer for Acheron is 53 to 85%. Whereas for Knights and MOC, it's between 56 and 84%. Apocalyptic Shadow has a range shrink further to 60 to 83%, and Pure Fiction brings it all the way down to 65 to 82%. If you're still trying to run some Acheron nonsense though, do note that the thresholds for 4-piece Quantum and 4-piece DOT are relatively close, with 4-piece DOT trading 2% defense shred for 12% attack, which is about equal if not better if I had to guess. I'd only advise running this set if you have either Black Swan, Hysolence, or somehow the DOT Trotters return in endgame sometime in like version 5, I don't know. In other words, for Quantum to pay off, you'll likely want your 2 defense shred choices to include Mortenax, plus either one of Welt, Ashvale, or Pella if you're going for a budget comp, or Cypher with both Pearls on Blade and Dressig on herself, if you really need her for some sort of specific matchup solve like Flame Reaver. Note that Blade and Wolfie hit 87% defense shred together, which is way past the amount needed to overcap with 4-piece Quantum's 20% defense shred, making Pioneer better by about 2%, even assuming you can make Quantum weakness consistent. Now, just for thoroughness sake, there is a fact that E2 Blade changes Acheron's ults into follow-up attacks, opening the door to both the Valorous and Duke Relic sets. Well, actually, Valorous is automatically out of the contention for best in slot, due to the majority of its stats being in damage percent, which Acheron hecka oversaturates on with E2 Blade, and her E0 S1 now giving her 346% damage at minimum. So instead, let's focus on the much more attack percent heavy Duke, and see just how much of an improvement it is for Acheron, if at all. However, we can't just calculate Duke as a flat 20% damage and 48% attack boost for her ult and call it a day. This is because, similar to how swordplay functions, Duke's attack boost ramps up per hit landed on the enemy, and more importantly, resets the attack buff upon each new follow-up attack, which for Acheron means each new ult. As such, to figure out how much attack percent Acheron actually ends up gaining per ult, we need to break apart her ult hits and multipliers to see on average how much attack percent she actually gains every time she weaves for the Departed. Acheron's ult is actually made up of 3 slashes plus a finisher, with all single target hits locking onto the target with the most Crimson Knot stacks. The first slash is 2 single target hits into an AoE, the second slash is 3 single target hits into an AoE, the third slash is a single hit into an AoE, and the finisher is a weak into a strong AoE, and the 6 extra bounces from her A6 trace, seemingly happening both at the same time. With that in mind, it takes until about the second slash for Duke's attack buff to fully ramp up in AoE content, thanks to Acheron being able to hit more enemies at once, versus the third slash in single target scenarios. As such, Duke actually ends up being ever so slightly stronger in AoE content than in single target, though it only makes about a 2% attack difference across the entire ultimate. Overall, the numbers work out such that Duke pretty much side-grades Pioneer with just Acheron and E2 Blade, but ends up being about a 4 to 5% improvement if you add an Ash fail as a result of his extra 120% crit damage saturating Pioneer's crit damage contributions. Note that Pioneer is actually providing about a 17% final damage increase with E2 Blade's extra damage percent, and a 12% final damage increase with the Ash Blade core, not the 18% value mentioned earlier with just E0 Blade. And, interestingly, after all of this, Quantum is still a Duke side grade, even a slight upgrade outside of pure fiction, though of course it does need the Quantum weakness to actually be good, which is unreliable to say the least. That being said, yeah, it's kind of funny how at least when it comes to Relics, Hoyo has never really moved past the power level set by Quantum's 20 defense shred way back in 1.0. Planers are a bit of a different story though. Even with damage being super saturated here, Acheron still wants Duran over Izumo with E2 Blade just because Duran's overall numbers are bigger. It's a 2% difference and still a 0.6% advantage if you include Welt's full 100% damage bonus on top of that for some odd reason, which is crazy to think about. Moving on from one Emanator to the next though, Madame Herta surprisingly has almost the exact same amount of damage percent as Acheron does on her enhanced skill, 271.2% versus Acheron's 271%. Just a mere 0.2% difference is pretty crazy. Not to mention that her crit damage is actually higher than Acheron's, thanks to herself 80% crit damage buff, no teammates needed. This results in Scholar being a similar power boost to the Herta as Pioneer is to Acheron, though it is worth noting that if her enhanced skill isn't hitting a 42 stack enemy, she loses the 50% ice damage boost in her base kit for her next enhanced skill, making Scholar's upside potentially even stronger. So that's it, right? Case dismissed, Madame Herta already has a clear winner for her best in slot relic set, right? Well, unlike Acheron who can largely afford to ignore her non-ult damage, the Herta can't just bank on her nuke skill only. After all, that nuke of hers is tied to an ult, and most E0 gamers will need to weave in a regular skill for energy. Since Scholar only boosts the other skills and ults by 20% damage, not 45%, the resulting amp drops a bit lower, ending up as only an 11.7% increase. As such, the overall damage distribution ends up working out so that the Herta gains at most a 17.2% increase, and that's assuming you don't hit a single 42 stack enemy, which is obviously a damage loss. Even to beat this generous estimate though, the defense shred threshold in which Quantum wins out never starts at 50% or above, regardless of game mode. And wouldn't you know it, just a Morty and an Anaxa signature is good enough to make Quantum set worth it. And since Anaxa can guarantee Quantum weakness pretty consistently, this makes Quantum the go-to set if you're running both dudes on the third team for Anomaly Arbitration and MOC, and at least competitive with Scholar in Apoc Shadow and Pure Fiction. Though of course, Anaxa in Pure Fiction is less than ideal, so you can technically manage by giving the signature to Mini Herta and praying for Quantum Week content. Or, if you didn't activate your speed traces, you could just run the Poet set instead and have the best damage dealing relic hands down for all of your attacks. Of course, there are real consequences to setting your damage dealer's speed to 95 or lower if she needs to take her turn in order to ult, which she usually does at E0, but it does make you wonder why she has a technically best in slot DPS set that becomes permanently inaccessible once you max her traces like you normally should. The funny thing is, Scholar actually represents an even lower damage increase at E2, since not only do your regular skills turn into enhanced skills, meaning that Scholar is super boosting half your enhanced skills instead of all of them, but the ability for those skills to also hit 42 stack enemies means that the damage contribution from Scholar gets even more diluted. This results in such a low defense shred threshold to cross that Quantum ends up always being better than Scholar, so long as you have space for both an Anaxa Sig and a Mortenax Blade on the team for an E2 Herta. If you think about it after all, Anaxa is always running 4-piece Quantum, and the 28% defense shred he gives himself is only 2% less than what Mortenax Blade offers. One can only imagine just how homeless of a relic set Scholar would have been on release if only Anaxa's defense shred was team-wide. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that. In terms of the overall takeaways, I think there's a few that come to mind. Hopefully I'll also be able to round up any stragglers that haven't been mentioned yet in terms of defense shred along the way. First is that the idea of chasing 100% defense shred is long behind us. We have so many new stats, so many new mechanics, so many new multipliers, that 100% defense shred, while a pipe dream still, just isn't necessary anymore. You don't even need anywhere close to that number in order to justify prioritizing it on the team over other stats, especially since, nowadays for the supports, it's usually tacked on anyways. Only having defense shred is the exception, not the norm. Gone are the Sunday E1s and the Phainon S1s of this world. Gone are the times when defense shred only investments, like Argente's E6 and Yunli's E2, are seen as acceptable. Heck, Evanescence has it on her E4, which, given the usual track record of Star Rail E4s, should show you how much they care about a simple defense shred multiplier now. Or rather, how much they don't care. Now, even Eidolons like Sir Ridger's E1, which is similarly focused on defense shred amp and was clearly inspired by Sunday's own E1, has a unique utility of opening Phainon's team options, and Nova Flirt Sparkle's E2, as previously mentioned, comes on an already extremely versatile base kit. Even in Mortenax Blade's case, where I only discussed his amp, the reason I even considered him in the Herta teams in the first place is because of his extra utility as a sustain and an offensive attack spamming support. Particularly important when protecting a genius and a feeble scholar. Don't miss the full picture for the spreadsheets. However, I still think that monitoring defense shred is an important thing to do, simply because every DPS's most important support will come with defense shred in either their kit or early Eidolons. Think Phainon and Ceridra, Black Swan and Hycelen, Sparkle and Archer, Aglaia and Sunday into Cyrene, Sparksy and Silverwolf 999 into Yao Guang, Phainon into Ashvale, Firefly into the Fugue, and then into the Dahlia, Remembrance into Evernight, so on and so forth. Where defense shred already exists in a character's kit, more defense shred will come via their support to accompany it. That's just how the math works. That being said, I do have to wonder about the Herta, who has no defense shred built in, yet benefits passively from the new gen defense shred follow-up spammers like Ash Blade. Second, DPS relic sets have seen very little, if any, power creep since 4-piece Quantum set the standard at bonus damage plus 20 defense shred. Rather, more relic sets have been made in order to make the same power level accessible to more different archetypes. As such, if you're not sure what to spend your Trailblade's power towards, it never hurts to invest into the big three of Quantum, Sacrados, and Eagle, or their respective archetypes. The first two are so good that their defense shred and supportive crit damage boosts have been repurposed into multiple different relics, while the thirst effect is so powerful that while there are plenty of 2-piece speed relics now, they've never made a relic set with advance forward ever since. Third, conditional defense shred investments are just not worth it. If you have to work to make your defense shred valuable rather than have it consistently be up, then you're either not stacking enough of it to make it valuable, or you lose too much by having it gone that it's just not worth building into. For probably the most notorious example, Nova Qingliu's 25% defense shred for overcapping on Syzygy was not nearly consistent enough to stop her from being frozen in the meta even one patch after her revival. As for Break, E1 Ron Mei gaining 20% defense shred on her unreliable ult wasn't enough to save her from being kicked out by Harmony MC in today's optimal Break teams. Similarly, Lynch's E1 20% defense shred versus broken enemies and high toughness dealing support game plan wasn't enough to keep her on the Break team when their plan no longer revolved around needing enemies to be broken. E2 Saber's defense shred ramp-up mechanic was too limited to make her a competent DPS since she couldn't spam ults nearly enough to justify it, while Aglaya's E2 was too awkward to maintain a consistent value around, especially when needing either a high-speed Sunday or Cyrene to help her spam turns. Over-focusing on finicky conditions like these is where the trap of over-investing in defense shred mainly lies. Even with meta supports, aiming for a near 100 defense shred cap alone isn't going to make your Welt work on a team with enough survivability and not enough attacks, or an E2 Sparkle work on a team that can't effectively use her action advance or skill points, or a Silver Wolf work for a team that doesn't care for her debuffs. Heck, even Mortenax Blade is wasted on teams like Phainon's, where his core flame generation is pitiful and his sub DPS is wasted, and on Break teams, where his crit sub DPS playstyle is discouraged, and his taunt value does nothing for the team's already excellent survivability. Don't bend over backwards to make your supports work. They should be helping the DPS, not shackling them down. And finally, free, powerful utility options will eventually be pushed out of the meta in some way. Maybe it's through being demanded on multiple teams, but only being able to fit in one, like with the main character and tutorial. Maybe it's by being directly power crept, as was the case with Welt into both Ashvale and Mortenax. And well, despite Welt being free, he does still sit at a pretty expensive E4 baseline for his utility nowadays, as well as Pearls by Cypher's S1 and archetype-specific Amp Light Cones. Either way, trying to find a cheap option on one side eventually leaves the other two picking up the slack, especially with Starward mode being soon upon us. To chase meta is to bundle, and there's simply no way around it, only a smart way to form your groups. So perhaps calling defense shred the most expensive stat in Honkai Star Rail isn't exactly accurate nowadays. After all, so many of the cheap and or generically powerful options have defense shred built in, and I'd say they're pretty cost efficient. Plus, they tend to come pretty early to serve as something of an extra reward for vertical investment. If anything, it's the most sidelined stat in the game now, treated as a buy one get one free sort of multiplier. Quite ironic that the only stat that loves prioritizing more of itself is now being given the least priority in the game. Low enough priority, in fact, that a 1.0 set can still sneak in and still prove itself to be the greatest. Thanks for watching.